Elindra did not see the envelope until it landed on the gift table, right between the hand-knitted blankets and the silver rattle engraved with the Valdrin crest. One moment, she was laughing at something Corwin said, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where her baby had just kicked for the 100th time that day. The great hall smelled of honeyed wine and white jasmine, the flowers she had personally chosen for the garlands draped across every arch and pillar. Candlelight caught the crystal goblets, throwing tiny rainbows across the stone walls. Everything was golden. Everything was warm. She was 7 months pregnant, and she had never been happier. The next moment, silence crashed through the great hall like a wave of ice water. Every conversation stopped. Every laugh died mid-breath. Elindra looked up from Corwin's face and followed the gazes of 100 guests toward the doorway, and the warmth drained from her body as though someone had opened a vein. Thandric stood in the entrance. Thandric, Alpha King of Valdrin, the man who had whispered promises against her skin just that morning, who had pressed his lips to her forehead and told her he could not wait to meet their child. The man whose iron gray eyes had softened every single time they found hers across a crowded room. Those eyes were not soft now. His dark hair, usually swept back with careless elegance, fell across his forehead in disarray. His jaw was locked so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. He wore his council coat, the formal black one with silver clasps, which meant he had come straight from his advisors without stopping, without thinking, without breathing, possibly because he looked like a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. Thandric? Her voice came out small, uncertain, wrong somehow in a room that had gone so terribly quiet. What is wrong? I thought you were in council until evening. He did not answer. Instead, he walked toward her with measured steps. Each footfall echoed against the stone floor like a countdown. The guests parted around him like water around a blade, pulling back with wide eyes and held breaths, and Elindra saw their faces shift from confusion to something worse, fear. Something cold began to uncurl in the pit of her stomach. Not the baby, something older. Something that had lived inside her since childhood, since the years before Thandric, when she had learned that the people you loved most were always the ones who could hurt you the worst. Open it. He stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough to touch, far enough to feel like a canyon. His voice was flat, scraped clean of every tender note she had come to treasure over their 2 years of marriage. Elindra's fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope. The paper was thick, official, stamped with the royal seal she had seen on treaties and death warrants. She broke the wax with clumsy hands, her heart beat so loud in her own ears she was certain the entire hall could hear it. The words blurred, then sharpened into focus. Dissolution of the mating bond. Annulment of marriage. Revocation of Luna status. The document slipped from her fingers and floated to the floor like a dead leaf. I do not understand. She looked up at him, searching those iron gray eyes for any trace of the man who had held her through her nightmares, who had wept the first time they heard the baby's heartbeat together, who had laid his palm flat against her belly just last night and whispered, I already love you, little one. Thandric, what is this? It is exactly what it looks like. His jaw tightened, every muscle rigid with barely contained fury. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings and leave the palace. You will not take anything that belongs to the crown. You will not speak to anyone on your way out, and you will never set foot on Valdrin territory again. Elindra's hand flew to her belly. Instinct. Pure and primal and older than thought. Our baby is not mine. The words hit her like a physical blow, so hard her knees nearly buckled. We both know it. The great hall had transformed into a courtroom. Elindra could feel 100 pairs of eyes boring into her, whispers slithering through the crowd like something venomous. Women she had called friends. Advisors who had bowed to her just yesterday. All of them watching her world collapse in real time, and not one of them stepping forward. Thandric, I have never been unfaithful to you. She forced steel into her voice, though her heart was splintering along fault lines she did not know existed. Not once. Not ever. I do not know what you have been told, but it is a lie. A lie? Something dangerous flickered across his face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of letters bound with a red ribbon. She recognized it instantly. It was hers, from her private writing desk. Then explain these. He threw them at her feet. Elindra did not need to pick them up. She could see the handwriting from where she stood. Elegant loops that looked almost like hers. Almost. Love letters, passionate, explicit, addressed to someone called my secret heart and signed with her initial. I did not write those. Her voice cracked. Thandric, look at me. You know my handwriting. You have read 1,000 notes from me. Look closely, and you will see the difference. Look for the moon circle. I always end with the moon circle. These letters do not have it because I did not write them. Something shifted in his face. A flicker. The ghost of doubt. I have had 3 scribes analyze them. He cut her off, but his voice caught on the words. They confirmed the match. Then they are wrong. Or they are lying. Or someone forged them. Elindra stepped toward him, desperate, reaching for his hand. Please, just give me a chance to prove. You have had 2 years to prove your loyalty. Thandric's voice rose, filling the hall. 2 years of secret meetings and whispered conversations. 2 years of disappearing for hours with no explanation. Did you think I would not notice? Did you think I was that blind? The accusations hit her like arrows, each one more bewildering than the last. Secret meetings. She had been visiting the healers for her difficult pregnancy. Whispered conversations. She had been planning his birthday celebration with Corwin. Disappearing for hours. Every absence had an innocent explanation. Every single one. If he had only asked. If you had just asked me. Elindra's tears spilled over, hot against her cold cheeks. Talked to me. Trusted me the way I have always trusted you. Instead of what? Giving you time to spin more lies? He laughed, and the sound was so bitter, so broken, that it barely qualified as laughter at all. I trusted you, Elindra. I gave you everything. My heart, my throne, my people. And you repaid me by carrying another man's child and trying to pass his bastard off as my heir. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and something inside Elindra snapped. Not broke, snapped. Like a bone forced past its limit, past the point where pain becomes something else entirely. Something sharper, something that burns. How dare you? Her voice came out low, shaking, not with weakness, but with a rage so vast it could have swallowed the hall whole. How dare you speak about our child that way? I have loved you faithfully since the day we met. I have bled for this pack. I have sacrificed for this crown. I have endured every cruel whisper from people who thought I was not good enough for you. And this is how you repay me? Public humiliation based on forged letters? For one heartbeat, something flickered in Thandric's eyes. Doubt, pain, the ghost of the man she had married. Then it vanished. Locked away behind walls of iron and ice and wounded pride. Take her to her chambers. He turned to the guards. She has 1 hour. That morning, before the baby shower, before the envelope, before everything fractured, Alindra had been walking through the servants' corridor when she heard the sound. A soft whimper, quickly muffled. She had stopped, turned, and found Petra, the youngest kitchen maid, barely 16, pressed against the wall with the head steward looming over her. A shattered vase at their feet. The steward's hand raised. Alindra had stepped between them without thinking. "The vase was my fault," she had said calmly, meeting the steward's furious gaze with quiet authority. "I knocked it from the shelf this morning. It was careless of me. Put it on my account." The steward had sputtered, looked between the Luna and the cowering girl, then retreated with a curt bow. When he was gone, Alindra had knelt beside Petra, taken her trembling hand, and wrapped a strip of cloth around the cut on her palm where a shard of ceramic had sliced the skin. "You are safe," she had whispered. "No one will touch you while I am here." That felt like a lifetime ago now. The guards flanked her like she was a criminal. Alindra walked through the hall she had come to call home, past tapestries she had helped choose, past servants who would not meet her eyes, past the kitchen corridor where Petra pressed herself against the wall with tears streaming down her face, reaching out a hand that Alindra could not take. Her own hand never left her belly, as if she could shield her baby from the nightmare unfolding around them. "Alindra, wait." The voice made her stumble. She turned to find Lysanthia hurrying toward her, silk skirts rustling, golden hair catching the torchlight like a halo. Thandric's younger sister, the woman who had welcomed Alindra into the family when no one else would, who had held her hand through the early months of pregnancy, who had braided her hair and told her stories about their mother and promised to be the best aunt the baby could ask for. Lysanthia. Alindra's voice broke with relief. "Thank the gods! You have to talk to him. Make him see reason. Those letters are not mine. Someone is framing me. Please, you know me. You know I would never." Lysanthia took Alindra's hands, squeezed gently. Her face crumpled with what looked like sympathy. Oh, sweet, foolish Alindra. The words did not register at first. The tone did. Something about it was wrong. Off-key, like a lullaby sung slightly too slow. "What? Did you really think you could keep it hidden forever?" Lysanthia's golden eyes glittered, and Alindra realized with dawning, creeping, bone-deep horror that the emotion swimming in them was not sympathy at all. It was triumph. Alindra's blood turned to ice in her veins. "Lysanthia. What are you—" "Shh." Lysanthia pressed a finger to Alindra's lips, leaning close enough that only she could hear. Her perfume was lily of the valley. It had always smelled sweet before. Now it smelled like something rotting beneath a beautiful flower. "You should have stayed in whatever backwater village my brother found you in. The Luna seat was never meant for a nobody like you. I tried to warn him, tried to tell him that common blood would always show its true colors eventually. But he would not listen, so I had to show him." The truth crashed over Alindra like a collapsing wall. "It was you." The words came out strangled, barely audible. "You forged the letters. You fed him lies. You made him believe—" Careful, Lysanthia's smile was a knife wrapped in velvet. "Accusations like that could be considered treason, and we both know how my brother handles traitors." She stepped back, raising her voice so the guards could hear, adjusting her face into a mask of wounded compassion. I am so sorry, Elindra. I truly thought you were different. I will pray to the moon goddess for your soul. Then she swept away. Her golden hair caught the torchlight one last time, and Elindra stood frozen in the corridor as the full magnitude of the betrayal settled over her like a burial shroud. Lysanthia, her sister-in-law, her friend, the woman she had trusted with her fears and her hopes and her excitement about the baby, the woman who had just stolen everything. Back in the chambers that were no longer hers, Elindra packed with numb efficiency. 2 dresses, her mother's pearl hairpin, the only keepsake she had of a woman who died giving her life. A leather journal filled with sketches of the baby she had imagined, the nursery she had planned, the future that no longer existed. She left behind the silk gowns Thandric had commissioned for her, the jewelry bearing the Valdrin crest, the crown she had worn exactly once at their bonding ceremony, when he had looked at her like she hung the moon and every star around it. None of it was hers anymore. Perhaps it never had been. A soft knock. The door cracked open and Corwin slipped inside, round face blotchy with tears. I tried to speak to him. Corwin's voice was barely a whisper. He would not listen. Elindra, I know you did not do this. I know those letters are lies. Lysanthia. The name tasted like poison on her tongue. She forged them. She admitted it to me in the corridor, quiet enough that no one else heard. That viper. Corwin's eyes went wide. I always knew something was wrong with her. The way she smiled too sweetly, agreed too easily. But I never thought she would go this far. Neither did I. Elindra cinched her bag closed. And now it does not matter. I have no proof, just my word against hers. And we both know whose word Thandric will believe. The baby kicked, harder this time, as if protesting the injustice. Corwin pressed a small pouch into Elindra's hands. There was coin inside, and a folded piece of paper. My grandmother Orindra. She lives in Thornwick, past the eastern mountains. Give her this letter. Tell her I sent you. She will give you shelter. Tears blurred Elindra's vision. Corwin, I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am telling. Corwin gripped her shoulders, fierce and steady. You are the strongest woman I know, Elindra. Survive this. Find the truth. And when you are ready, burn Lysanthia's world to the ground. She paused, then added in a whisper so quiet it was almost just breath. The autumn equinox is in 6 weeks. If there is no challenge before then, Lysanthia plans to present a new bride, a princess from the Southern Isles. Once the bonding ceremony happens, your name will be struck from Valdrin's records forever. 6 weeks, Elindra. That is all you have. The door burst open. 2 guards filled the threshold. Time is up, the larger one said without meeting her eyes. The Alpha King wants you gone before sunset. Corwin squeezed Elindra's hand one final time, then stepped away, her face carefully neutral, playing the role of obedient subject while her heart shattered in silence. Elindra walked out of the palace with her head high. She did not look back. Not at the gardens where Thandric had first kissed her under the wisteria. Not at the tower window where he used to watch for her return whenever she visited the village. Not at the nursery door, still half painted the soft sage green they had chosen together just a week ago. Looking back would destroy her, and she could not afford to be destroyed. Not yet. Not when she had a child depending on her. Not when Lysanthia was back in that palace, smiling her golden smile, enjoying the wreckage she had made. The palace gates closed behind her with a groan of iron. Elindra stood on the road alone, exiled, carrying everything she owned in a single bag and everything she loved beneath her heart. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, and the air smelled like autumn coming, like endings. She turned east, toward the mountains, and behind her, in the highest window of the east tower, Lysanthia stood watching. She held a candle in one hand and a letter in the other. She touched the flame to the paper and watched it curl and blacken, the evidence of her instructions to Sedwin Hallow turning to ash. But when the fire had done its work, she opened a drawer, a hidden compartment behind the false bottom, and she placed a second letter inside, one she could not bring herself to destroy. Her mother's handwriting, faded with age, the last words Lysanthia had from the woman who died when she was 8 years old. Take care of your brother. Never let anyone come between the two of you. Lysanthia closed the drawer. She told herself she had done the right thing. She told herself she was protecting the only family she had left, and if her hands trembled as she blew out the candle, well, no one was watching to notice. The journey took 4 days. Elindra walked for the first 6 hours until her ankles swelled so badly she could no longer feel her feet. The road east wound through farmland and forest, past villages that grew smaller and farther apart with each mile. She kept her hood up, her head down, her hand pressed to the curve of her belly where the baby shifted restlessly, as if sensing the wrongness of everything around them. She slept the first night in a barn behind a farmstead, burrowing into a pile of hay that smelled of dust and dried clover and something faintly sweet that reminded her of the stables at the palace. She did not cry. Crying required energy she could not spare. Instead, she lay in the dark and listened to the sound of her own breathing, the rustle of mice in the rafters, the distant bark of a dog, and she made a list. Things she knew to be true. She had not written those letters. Lysanthia had admitted to forging them. The scribes had lied or been replaced. Somewhere there was proof. And she had 6 weeks to find it before her name was erased from history and Thandric married another woman. 6 weeks. 42 days to save everything. The second morning, a farmer's wife found her sitting by the road, unable to stand. The woman was broad-shouldered and weathered, with kind eyes and rough hands, and she took one look at Elindra's pregnant belly and dust-stained dress and said, "Get in the cart, girl," without asking a single question. They rode together for a day and a half. The woman's name was Gretchen, and she talked about her sheep and her husband's bad knee and the price of wool at the autumn market. Elindra listened and nodded and let the ordinary words wash over her like warm water. Gretchen did not ask where she was going or why she was alone or what had put that haunted look behind her eyes. She simply shared her bread and her blanket and her company, and when they reached the crossroads where their paths diverged, she pressed Elindra's hand and said, "Whatever it is, you look like the kind of woman who will figure it out." Elindra nearly broke then, nearly let the tears come, but she swallowed them, thanked Gretchen, and kept walking. On the 4th day, she saw Thornwick. It was exactly as Corwin had described, a village so small it barely qualified as a dot on any map. 50 stone cottages clustered around a single well, sheep grazing on the hillsides, the smell of peat smoke and baking bread drifting through the cool mountain air. It looked like the kind of place the world had forgotten, the kind of place where a woman could disappear or regroup. Corwin's grandmother lived in a cottage at the edge of the village, half hidden by a garden overgrown with herbs and wildflowers. The door opened before Elindra could knock. Orindra was not what she expected. The woman was small, barely 5 feet, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes the color of flint. Everything about her was sharp, her cheekbones, her gaze, the way she stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame as if deciding whether to let the world in or keep it out. So you are the Luna who was not. Orindra studied her from head to toe, taking in the travel-stained dress, the swollen ankles, the exhaustion carved into every line of her face, the protective curve of her hand over her belly. Corwin's letter arrived by Raven yesterday. She paused. You look like death warmed over. Come inside before you collapse. The cottage was small but warm, filled with the scent of dried rosemary and wood smoke, and something sharp and medicinal that Elindra could not quite identify. Bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling. Books lined every surface. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing shadows that danced across walls covered in handwritten notes and strange diagrams. Orindra sat her down by the fire, pressed a bowl of stew into her hands, and waited. Elindra ate, mechanically at first, barely tasting the food, then with growing hunger as her body remembered that it was feeding more than just herself. When the bowl was empty, she told Orindra everything. The baby shower, the envelope, the divorce papers, the forged letters, Thandric's rage and his cold, cold eyes, Lysanthia's whispered confession in the corridor. When she finished, the cottage was quiet except for the pop and hiss of the fire. Lysanthia Valdrin. Orindra finally said the name like she was tasting something bitter. I remember her mother. Same golden hair. Same poisoned smile. She tried to have me burned as a witch 40 years ago because I refused to make her a love potion. Orindra's thin lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. Some bloodlines carry rot through every generation. You knew her? I know the type. Orindra leaned forward, firelight deepening the lines of her face. Tell me, girl. These letters that were supposedly yours, did anyone besides the scribes examine them? Elindra frowned. He said 3 scribes confirmed the handwriting matched mine. And who appointed those scribes? The question hung in the air like smoke. Elindra's mind raced backward through the palace hierarchy. The scribes served at the pleasure of the royal family. Their appointments were handled by the Master of Records, who reported to the King's Council, which was overseen by Thandric's most trusted advisor, his sister. She controls the scribes. The realization hit Elindra like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. She could have paid them off, threatened them, replaced them with people loyal to her. Now you are thinking. Orindra's flint-colored eyes glittered with something that might have been approval. The question is not whether you are innocent. You know the answer to that. The question is how to prove it to a man who has been poisoned against you by someone he loves. There was something else Elindra needed to say. Something that had been nagging at her since the Great Hall, a detail so small it might mean nothing. Or everything. The moon circle. She spoke slowly, feeling her way through the thought. Every letter I have ever written, every note, every journal entry, I end them with a small circle drawn like a crescent moon. Thandric knows this. He used to tease me about it, said it was my secret signature. She looked up at Orindra. Those forged letters did not have it, not one of them. If Thandric had looked, truly looked, he would have seen it was missing. Then why did he not look? Because he was too angry, too hurt. Too convinced before he ever walked into that hall. Lysanthia had been whispering in his ear for months, maybe longer. By the time he saw those letters, he was already gone. Orindra nodded slowly. Then we need to find whoever crafted those forgeries, the real hand behind the ink, because it was not Lysanthia. Her handwriting is nothing like yours. No. Elindra agreed. She had someone else do it. Someone skilled enough to fool 3 scribes, or at least to fool scribes who had already been instructed on what to find. Then, that is where we start. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm of survival and investigation. But Elindra refused to sit idle while others searched. She had spent 2 years in the palace library, reading everything she could find, desperate to educate herself into someone worthy of a king. Among those books had been a treatise on ink making and calligraphy by a scholar from the eastern provinces. She had read it because she loved the feel of pen on paper, loved the way different inks caught the light. She never imagined that knowledge would save her life. On the 3rd day in Thornwick, Elindra asked Orindra for the forged letters, the ones Thandric had thrown at her feet. She did not have them. They were back at the palace. But Corwin had managed to copy several passages before Lysanthia locked them away, and those copies arrived by Raven on the 5th day. Elindra spread them on the table beside her own handwriting samples from the journal she had brought, and she began to analyze. The strokes were close, very close. Whoever had done this was talented. But Elindra noticed something that a paid scribe performing a cursory comparison might miss. The ink. She held the copied passages up to the light and studied the way the letters sat on the paper, the faint variations in color, the way certain strokes feathered at the edges. This is court ink, she told Orindra, her heart beating faster. The expensive kind, made with iron gall and oak tannin. You can only get it from the palace scriptorium or from specialized merchants in the capital. If we can find who purchased a large quantity of this specific ink outside the normal palace supply, we can trace it back to the forger. Orindra looked at her with something new in those sharp eyes, something that went beyond approval into genuine respect. Corwin was right about you, the old woman said quietly. You are not just strong, you are clever. That is far more dangerous. Orindra had her own weapons, connections Elindra never would have expected. A network built over 7 decades of living on the margins of power. Former servants dismissed from noble houses who still whispered to each other over market stalls. Traders who traveled between territories carrying gossip alongside their goods. A web of ordinary people who saw everything and were noticed by no one. Messages went out. Discreet inquiries. Careful questions about scribes and forgers and a golden-haired princess who always smiled too sweetly. And while they waited for answers, Elindra tried to heal. It was harder than she expected. The pregnancy drained her in ways the healers at the palace had warned about, but she had never truly understood until she was sleeping on a straw mattress instead of silk sheets, eating root vegetables instead of the elaborate meals the palace kitchens had prepared for her cravings. But the physical exhaustion was manageable. The emotional wounds were not. She dreamed of Thandric constantly. Not the cold stranger who had thrown divorce papers at her feet. The other Thandric, the one who had found her in that border village 3 years ago. She had been 20 then. A nobody serving ale in her uncle's tavern, wearing a dress with a patched hem and her mother's pearl hairpin because it was the only beautiful thing she owned. He had been traveling in disguise, trying to escape the weight of his crown for a single evening. He had ordered the cheapest ale and sat in the darkest corner, and she had treated him like any other customer because she had not known any better. He came back the next night, and the next, and the next. "Why do you keep returning?" she had finally asked on the fourth night, half annoyed and half intrigued. "The ale is not that good." "No," he had agreed. Those iron-gray eyes had been soft in the firelight, warm in a way she had never seen in a man's gaze before. Not hungry, not calculating, just open. "But you are." She had laughed, thought he was drunk, poured him another ale, and walked away with her heart doing something strange and fluttering behind her ribs. He came back every night for 2 weeks before she learned his real name. By then, it was too late. By then, she had already fallen in love with the man, not the crown. And he had fallen in love with the woman who treated him like a person instead of a king. Elindra woke from these dreams with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that threatened to consume her whole. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. He had humiliated her, cast her out, called their baby a bastard before every person she had ever known. But hatred and love were not opposites. They were neighbors, sharing walls so thin that sound bled through constantly. She could hear his voice through those walls even now, whispering, "I already love you, little one." She pressed her face into the pillow and screamed without sound. One morning, 2 weeks into her stay, Orindra found her retching behind the cottage, pale, shaking, unable to keep even water down. This sickness has lasted longer than it should. The old woman pressed a hand to Elindra's forehead, then moved lower, placing both palms on the swell of her belly with the practiced certainty of someone who had delivered 100 babies. Her eyes went wide. "Girl, has anyone told you?" "Told me what?" Orindra helped her stand, guided her back inside, sat her down by the fire with a gentleness that felt new, almost reverent. "The reason you are so exhausted, the reason this pregnancy has been so difficult, the reason you cannot keep food down and your back aches like it belongs to a woman twice your age." Orindra kept hold of her hands. "You are not carrying one child, Elindra. You are carrying 2. The world tilted on its axis. Twins. A boy and a girl, if I am reading the signs correctly." Orindra's weathered face softened. Strong heartbeats, both of them. Fighters, like their mother. Elindra's hands flew to her belly. The familiar flutter of movement that she had attributed to one restless baby suddenly made a different kind of sense. 2 sets of kicks, 2 heartbeats beneath her own, 2 lives she had been carrying through exhaustion and exile, and 4 days of walking with swollen feet and a broken heart. She began to laugh. Then she began to cry. Then she did both at once, her whole body shaking with the enormity of it. 2 children, Thandric's children. No matter what lies Lysanthia had fed him, no matter what poison she had poured into his ear, these babies were his. Half his stubborn jaw and half her dark hair, and entirely, completely, irrevocably theirs. She thought of him alone in that cold palace, surrounded by vipers, believing his mate had betrayed him, believing his heirs were not his own. And for one unguarded moment, the anger cracked wide open, and all she felt beneath it was grief so deep it had no bottom. Then she sealed it shut, locked it in the same iron box where she kept her broken heart and her memories of wisteria and firelight. Grief was a luxury she could not afford, not when she had 2 babies depending on her, not when Lysanthia was still out there, still smiling, still winning. "I need to find the forger," Elindra said, and her voice was steady, despite the tears still drying on her face. I need proof, and I need it before the autumn equinox, because in 4 weeks, Thandric is going to marry another woman, and my children will be erased from the Valdrin line forever. As if in answer, a raven landed on the windowsill. A tiny scroll was tied to its leg. Orindra retrieved it, unrolled the paper, and a slow, sharp smile spread across her face. It seems the gods are listening. She handed the message to Elindra. Your network of ink merchants paid off. The message was from one of Orindra's contacts, a retired trader who still kept ties with the capital's merchant guild. A man matching the description of a disgraced palace scribe had purchased 3 bottles of premium iron gall ink from a specialty shop 6 months ago, paid in gold. The shop owner remembered because the man had been nervous, sweating, and because he had asked for the exact formulation used in the royal scriptorium. His name was Sedwin Hallow. Dismissed from the palace archives 2 years prior for gambling debts, disappeared into the lower city. Then, 4 months ago, surfaced again with new clothes, cleared debts, and a newfound taste for expensive wine. He had been heard bragging after too many cups about a golden goose who had paid him handsomely for his particular talents. Elindra's ink analysis had led them straight to him. The specific formulation she identified matched the one Sedwin had purchased. We found him. Elindra breathed. We found the forger, but she could not go to him. Not now. The twins had made certain of that. At 7 months pregnant with 2 babies instead of 1, she could barely walk to the well without needing to rest. Her body was not her own anymore. It belonged to Rowan and Lyraveth, the names she had chosen in the quiet hours of the night, whispering them against her belly like prayers. So, Orindra went instead. Armed with a purse of silver from Corwin's pouch and instructions to offer Sedwin more money than Lysanthia had paid, in exchange for the truth and any evidence he might have kept. 5 days. That was how long Orindra would be gone. 5 days alone in the cottage with nothing but the fire and her journal and the twins kicking inside her like they were trying to fight their way out early. Meanwhile, far away in the palace, something was shifting. Thandric had not slept in 11 days. He told himself it was the affairs of state, the trade negotiations, the border disputes, the endless council meetings that Lysanthia insisted he attend, that she filled with talk of alliances and marriage prospects, and the political advantages of bonding with Princess Thessaly of the Southern Isles. But at night, when the palace was quiet and the torches burned low, he found himself standing outside the door to Elindra's old chambers. The room had been cleared on Lysanthia's orders. New linens, new curtains, the sage-green paint on the nursery wall covered over with neutral cream. But they had missed something. On the 14th night, Thandric pushed the door open and stood in the darkness. The room smelled like nothing now, stripped of every trace of her. No more of the lavender oil she used to rub into her temples when she had headaches. No more of the particular warmth that a room holds when someone has lived in it and loved in it and dreamed in it. Except, he crossed to the writing desk, opened the drawer, and found, tucked into the back corner where the cleaning staff had not thought to look, a leather journal. Small, worn soft at the edges, her handwriting on the first page. For our baby, so you will know how much you were wanted. Thandric sat down in the dark and began to read. Pages of sketches, a tiny face imagined from the shape of her belly, a nursery layout with notes about where the crib should go so the morning light would not wake the baby too early. lists of names with little stars beside the ones she loved most. And between the drawings, letters to their unborn child written in her hand. Your father is the bravest man I have ever known. He carries the weight of a kingdom and still finds time to sing to you at night, even though he thinks I am asleep when he does it. You are so loved, little one. So impossibly loved. Every page ended with the same mark, a small circle drawn like a crescent moon. Thandric turned to the forged letters. He had kept them. He did not know why. Perhaps some part of him, some stubborn, buried part that still believed in her, had refused to let them go. He spread them beside the journal, and he looked, truly looked, the way he should have looked months ago, the way he would have looked if rage and wounded pride had not blinded him. The handwriting was close, very close. Close enough to fool someone who was looking for confirmation rather than truth. But the moon circle was not there, not on a single letter. Thandric stared at the papers for a long time. The fire had burned to embers. The room was cold. His hands were shaking. He thought about calling for Lysanthia, asking her about the scribes, asking why, if the match was so certain, the most distinctive element of Elindra's handwriting was completely absent from every letter. But something stopped him, a whisper in the back of his mind that was not quite suspicion and not quite fear. Something more like the feeling you get when you realize you have been standing on thin ice and the first crack has just appeared beneath your feet. He put the journal in his coat, locked it against his heart, and said nothing. Not yet. Lysanthia introduced Lady Thessaly the following week. She was everything a political match should be. Young, beautiful in a polished, practiced way, educated, graceful, the daughter of a southern king whose fleet could triple Valdrin's naval power. They sat together at dinner. Thessaly spoke about trade routes and maritime law and the cultural heritage of the Southern Isles with intelligence and poise. She was perfectly pleasant, perfectly appropriate, and Thandric felt absolutely nothing. After the meal, when the others had withdrawn, Thessaly lingered. She stood by the window looking out at the mountains, her dark hair catching the moonlight, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet and surprisingly honest. I know your heart is not in this, Your Majesty. You do not have to pretend for my sake. I have been promised to men before. I know what it looks like when someone is going through the motions. Thandric said nothing. The chair beside your throne. Thessaly continued, still looking at the mountains. You keep glancing at it. Every few minutes, like you expect someone to be sitting there. Silence. I do not know what happened between you and your Luna. Thessaly turned to face him, and her eyes were kind in a way that cost her nothing and gave him everything. But I know grief when I see it, and whatever you have been told about her, some part of you does not believe it. She left him standing by the window. And for the first time in weeks, Thandric allowed himself to think the thought. He had been drowning under pride and fury and Lysanthia's endless reassurances. What if I was wrong? Back in Thornwick, Orindra returned on the 5th day. Elindra saw her face through the window and felt her stomach drop. The old woman's expression was grim, tight. She entered the cottage slowly, set a leather satchel on the table, and lowered herself into a chair as though her bones ached with something heavier than age. He is dead, Orindra said. Sedwin Hallow, throat cut in his rented room. 2 nights before I arrived. The locals are calling it a robbery, but nothing was taken except a strongbox. Lysanthia. Elindra's voice came out hollow. She is cleaning up loose ends, almost certainly. Orindra opened the satchel, but our friend Sedwin was cleverer than he looked. He kept insurance. She pulled out a bundle of papers, practice sheets covered in handwriting exercises. Elindra's name written over and over, each attempt closer to a perfect imitation. Sample letters with corrections in a different hand, elegant and feminine, with loops and flourishes that Elindra recognized from years of receiving notes from Lysanthia. And at the bottom of the bundle, a single note, payment for services rendered. Destroy this upon completion. SV Lysanthia's initials, Lysanthia's handwriting, and one more thing. Orindra lifted a small glass bottle from the satchel, dark liquid sloshed inside, iron gall ink, premium formulation, the exact same type Elindra had identified from the forgeries. Elindra's hands trembled as she held the evidence, all of it together, the practice sheets proving the forgery, the note in Lysanthia's own hand ordering the work, the ink connecting it to the letters, the same ink she had traced through the merchant guild. This could save me, she breathed. If Thandric sees this, if the court sees this, if Thandric sees this, he will have to choose between believing his eyes and believing his sister. Orindra's voice was careful. Men in his position do not always choose truth, girl. Sometimes pride screams louder. He will believe it. Elindra clutched the papers against her chest, pressing them close to where her twins shifted and kicked, as if even they understood what this meant. He has to. But even as she spoke, doubt crept in on quiet feet. The Thandric who had loved her would have believed. But the Thandric who had thrown those papers at her feet, who had called their children bastards, who had looked at her with ice instead of warmth. She did not know that man. She pressed her hand flat against her belly, felt two small lives moving beneath her palm, and chose to believe anyway. There is something else. Orindra's expression shifted, darkening further. My contact in the capital sent word. Lysanthia is not content with just removing you. She has been whispering about the Southern Isles match, the bonding ceremony with Lady Thessaly. It was meant for the equinox, but Lysanthia is pushing to accelerate. She wants it done within weeks. 4 weeks, Elindra whispered. I have 4 weeks before I lose everything permanently. She stood, one hand braced on the table for balance, the other pressed to the small of her aching back. Her body screamed at her. Her babies kicked in protest, but her eyes were clear, and her voice, when it came, did not shake. I am going back. I am going to confront Lysanthia publicly, show everyone what she has done, and clear my name. You are 7 months pregnant with twins. Orindra raised one silver eyebrow. You can barely stand without holding on to furniture. Then I will hold on to furniture while I destroy her. A pause. Then Orindra laughed. A real laugh, rusty from disuse, startled out of her. There it is, she said, looking at Elindra with something fierce and proud. There is the fire I have been waiting to see. She began gathering supplies from the shelves. We will need to plan this carefully. Lysanthia has spies everywhere. If she discovers you are coming before you are ready to strike, she will try to silence me. The way she silenced Sedwin. Elindra nodded. I know. But she thinks I am broken. She thinks I am hiding in some forgotten corner of the kingdom, waiting to give birth in shame and silence. She will not expect me to fight back. Orindra's smile was a blade. Then let us make sure she does not see you coming until it is far, far too late. 3 days before they were meant to leave for the capital, Elindra woke to the sound of horses. Not the lazy clop of farm animals heading to pasture. Not the gentle rhythm of a merchant's cart rolling through on its way to somewhere more important. These were war horses. She knew the difference the way anyone who had lived in a palace for 2 years knew the difference. War horses struck the ground like they meant to punish it. Fast, disciplined, and merciless. The kind of hooves that announced violence before it arrived. The sound cut through the pre-dawn silence of Thornwick like a blade drawn slowly across silk. Elindra pushed herself upright. The effort alone took several seconds. 8 months pregnant with twins, and her body had become a foreign country, swollen and aching and governed by laws she no longer recognized. Her back seized when she moved. Her hips protested when she swung her legs over the side of the narrow bed. Her ankles, thick and tender, throbbed with every heartbeat as though they had their own separate pulse. She braced one hand against the wall and pulled the curtain aside with the other. 6 riders in Valdrin colors were dismounting in the village square. The torches they carried threw harsh orange light across the cobblestones, across the terrified faces of villagers who had stumbled from their cottages in nightclothes, clutching children against their chests, across the gleaming black armor of soldiers who had absolutely no business being in a place this small and this forgotten, and this far from anything that mattered to the crown. At their head was a woman Elindra recognized instantly. Halvara Hale, Lysanthia's shadow, her closest friend and most ruthless enforcer. Tall, angular, with hair the color of dark copper pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Her eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky before snow, and Elindra had never once seen them blink at the wrong moment. At court functions, Halvara had always been there, standing 3 steps behind Lysanthia, watching, cataloging, filing away every whispered conversation and every unguarded expression for future use. Elindra had never liked the woman. Her instincts had recoiled from Halvara the same way a hand recoils from a flame, without thought, without reason, just the body knowing something the mind had not yet worked out. Now she understood what that something was. She found us. The words left Elindra's mouth in a strangled whisper, barely louder than the hammering of her own heart against her ribs. Orindra. She found us. The old woman was already moving. 70 years of life, and she crossed the cottage in 4 strides, pulling dried food and a water skin from the shelf, wrapping them in cloth, snatching a heavy wool cloak from the hook by the back door. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this scenario before, who had lived through enough danger to know that the difference between survival and catastrophe was measured in seconds, not minutes. The back door. There is a path through the hills. Orindra pressed the cloak into Elindra's hands, her flint-colored eyes sharp and unafraid. Follow the stone wall past the sheep pen. It leads uphill through a copse of birch trees to the old mill by the stream. Do not take the lower path. Do not stop to rest. And do not, under any circumstances, look back. You will be safe at the mill until I come for you. Elindra opened her mouth to respond, but before a single word could form, a pounding on the front door shattered the air between them. Not knocking, pounding. The kind that splintered wood and rattled hinges and announced that whatever stood on the other side had no intention of waiting for permission. Open in the name of the Alpha King. Halvara's voice sliced through the heavy oak door like it was paper. We have intelligence that the exile Elindra is sheltered within this village. Surrender her immediately. Cooperate, and no harm will come to your people. Resist, and this village will learn what happens to those who harbor traitors of the crown. The word traitor landed in Elindra's chest like a thrown stone. She was not a traitor. She had never been a traitor. She had been a faithful wife, a devoted Luna, a woman who had bled for the very crown that now hunted her through the mountains in the dark hours before dawn. But the truth did not matter to the soldiers on the other side of that door. They had their orders, and Elindra knew, with a certainty that sat cold and heavy in her stomach like a swallowed rock, exactly who had given those orders. Her hands flew to her belly. Both babies were kicking now, hard, frantic. Not the gentle fluttering she had grown accustomed to, but something urgent and panicked, as though they could feel the danger pressing in through the walls, seeping under the door like smoke. She pressed her palms flat against the movement and tried to steady her breathing, tried to send some signal through skin and muscle and bone that she was still here, still standing, still protecting them. She looked at Arindra, at the front door where the hinges groaned under another blow, at the narrow back passage that led to the hills and the darkness beyond. She could not run. The thought was clear and clinical and utterly devastating. She could not run fast enough, could not run far enough, not with her back seizing every few steps, not with her ankles swelling inside boots that had been loose 3 weeks ago and were now tight as tourniquets, not carrying the weight of 2 lives low in her pelvis, pressing down with a pressure that made every stride feel like wading through deep water. And she could not let these people suffer for her. Thornwick was 50 families, farmers with calloused hands and quiet lives, shepherds who knew every lamb by name, old women who hung herbs in their windows and baked bread on Sundays, children who chased each other around the well and had never seen a soldier in armor and did not know what the sound of war horses meant. They had done nothing wrong. They had committed no crime. Their only offense was living in the same village where a desperate, pregnant, discarded woman had stumbled in from the road one evening and asked for a place to sleep. "I will go out to them," Elindra said. The words tasted like ashes and iron and the memory of every sacrifice she had already made. "I will not let them burn homes and hurt people because of me. Do not be a fool." Orindra gripped her arm with a strength that belonged to someone half her age. Her voice dropped low, urgent, stripped of its usual dry wit. "Listen to me very carefully. Lysanthia did not send 6 armed soldiers on war horses to bring you back for a fair hearing. She did not send Halvara Hale to deliver an invitation to explain yourself before the council. She sent them to make you disappear, the way Sedwin Hallow disappeared, quietly, permanently, with a story prepared in advance about how you resisted, how you attacked a soldier, how they had no choice. The pounding on the front door reached a crescendo. Wood cracked. A panel buckled inward, and through the gap Elindra could see torchlight and the edge of a black gauntlet. Elindra looked at the evidence inside her bag. Sedwin's practice sheets covered in failed attempts at her handwriting, the note bearing Lysanthia's initials, and her order to destroy everything. The bottle of iron gall ink that matched the forgeries. The careful analysis Elindra herself had compiled, cross-referencing the ink composition with merchant records, building a chain of proof that led from the forger's desk straight to the golden-haired princess who had orchestrated every lie. This was not just her survival in that bag. It was her children's future, their names, their legitimacy, their right to exist as Valdrin heirs rather than nameless bastards born in exile to a disgraced mother. If Halvara took that bag, everything was over. The mill. Elindra's voice steadied into something she almost did not recognize. Something that sounded less like fear and more like the particular calm that descends when a person has run out of options and discovered, at the very bottom of their terror, a bedrock of resolve they did not know they possessed. I will hide there. But Arindra, if they search the village, they cannot find anything connecting you to me. Not a letter, not a scrap of paper, not a single thread. Arindra's smile was thin and sharp enough to draw blood. I have been hiding things from nobles since before Lysanthia's mother learned to hold a quill. They will find an old woman alone in a cottage with nothing but herbs and bad eyesight and a very poor memory. Now go, out the back, through the birch trees. Do not stop running until you reach the water wheel. And if your body tells you it cannot go any farther, you tell it that it does not have a choice. Elindra grabbed her bag, pressed the evidence deep inside, beneath the cloak and the dried bread and the water skin, slung it across her body so the strap crossed over her chest and the weight rested against her hip rather than her belly. Then she slipped through the back door and into the cold, wet, pre-dawn darkness. The hills behind the village were steeper than she remembered. Every step sent fire through her hips. Her lower back screamed with a pain that radiated outward like cracks in glass, shooting down her legs and up her spine simultaneously. Her lungs burned from the cold air and the exertion and the sheer unfairness of trying to climb a hillside at 8 months pregnant with twins, while soldiers searched for her in the valley below. She followed the stone wall, found the sheep pen, turned uphill through the birch trees, their white trunks ghostly in the thin light, their bare branches reaching overhead like the fingers of something skeletal and patient. Twice she had to stop. The first time, she bent forward with her hands braced on her knees, head hanging, gulping air while a cramp rolled through her abdomen like a wave. Not a contraction, not a real one, but her body issuing a warning, loud and unmistakable, that what she was doing fell somewhere between reckless and suicidal. The second time, she simply could not move. Her legs locked, her vision blurred at the edges. She stood in the middle of the path with one hand wrapped around a birch trunk and the other cradling the underside of her belly, holding her children up as though she could physically prevent them from arriving early through sheer force of will. Behind her and below, she could hear the sounds of the search, doors being kicked open, the sharp crack of wood breaking, Halvara's voice cutting through the chaos, cold and precise, demanding answers that the villagers of Thornwick could not give because they genuinely did not know where Elindra had gone. Then a sound that made her blood curdle in her veins, the roar of fire, not a torch, something larger, the deep, hungry sound of timber catching, and the sharp crack of a roof beam giving way. They were burning something, a barn, a storage shed. She could not tell from this distance, but the message was clear. A warning, written in flames and ash, for anyone who considered lying to protect the woman Lysanthia wanted silenced. Elindra closed her eyes, breathed through the pain in her back and the pain in her heart and the guilt that wrapped itself around her throat like a hand. These people were suffering because of her, because she had knocked on a door and asked for shelter and been foolish enough to believe that hiding would be enough. She forced her legs to move, one step, then another, then another. The old mill appeared through the trees like something out of a half-remembered nightmare. A crumbling stone structure with a roof that sagged in the middle, straddling a narrow stream whose course had shifted years ago, leaving the water wheel hanging motionless and choked with dead vines and brown leaves. The doorway was low, barely 5 feet, and she had to duck to enter, pressing one hand against the damp stone lintel. Inside, the air smelled of rot and standing water and the particular mustiness of a place that had been abandoned so long it had forgotten what it was for. Weak gray light filtered through gaps in the walls. The wooden machinery of the mill stood frozen in place, gears rusted, ropes frayed, everything coated in a thick layer of dust and neglect. Elindra sank to the ground against the far wall because her legs simply refused to hold her for one more second. She pressed her back against the cold stone, drew her knees up as far as her belly would allow, and clamped one hand over her mouth to muffle the sound of her breathing, which was coming in ragged, hitching gasps that sounded far too loud in the morning stillness. The other hand wrapped around her belly. Inside her, the twins had gone still, quiet, waiting, as though they understood in whatever wordless, primal way that unborn children understand the world beyond the womb, that silence was survival. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. Close, so close that Elindra could hear the creak of leather armor and the soft clink of a sword against a belt buckle. Spread out. Halvara's voice was no more than 30 paces away. She cannot have gone far, not in her condition. Check every structure within a mile of the village, every barn, every shed, every ruin. If you find her, do not engage in conversation. Do not listen to whatever story she attempts to tell. Secure her. Take whatever she is carrying, and bring it directly to me. The evidence she has gathered is the priority. Lysanthia's instructions were explicit on that point. There it was. Not a retrieval, not an arrest. An elimination disguised as duty, wrapped in the language of loyalty to the crown. Lysanthia did not want Elindra brought back to face justice. She wanted the evidence destroyed and the witness removed, permanently, cleanly, with enough plausible deniability to survive any questions that might follow. The footsteps split. Some went left, fading toward the southern edge of the forest. Some went right, moving uphill toward the ridge, and one set came directly toward the mill, steady, measured, the boots of a single soldier approaching the doorway. Elindra pressed her spine flat against the stone and stopped breathing. Her heartbeat hammered so violently she could feel it in her teeth, in her temples, in the tips of her fingers. Every muscle in her body locked tight. Her vision narrowed to the rectangle of gray light that marked the entrance. A shadow filled the doorway. The soldier was young, barely 20, if that. He held a torch in one hand that threw wild, jumping shadows across the ruined machinery, across the sagging roof beams, across the pregnant woman pressed into the far corner, with her hand over her mouth and her eyes wide with a terror that had moved past panic into something almost calm, almost clear. He saw her. Their gazes locked across 10 feet of dusty, rotten air. His torch hand trembled. His mouth opened. And in the half-second before sound left his throat, Elindra moved. Not away from him. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to press deeper into the corner, to make herself small, to hope that stillness might somehow make her invisible. But she had been still for months. She had been small. She had been invisible. She had let other people make decisions about her life and her body and her future. And she was done. She was done. Her hand closed around the frayed rope that dangled from the old grain hoist directly above the soldier's head. She had noticed it when she entered, filed it away in the part of her brain that was always watching, always assessing. the part that had kept her alive during 4 days of walking and 2 months of hiding and a lifetime of being underestimated. She pulled, not with the strength of a soldier or a warrior or anyone who had ever been trained for combat, with the strength of a woman who had been pushed past every limit she thought she had, the strength of a mother whose children were on the other side of that rope, and the only thing between them and annihilation was whatever she could summon from the very deepest part of herself. The rusted mechanism above groaned. Metal shrieked against metal, and a heavy wooden beam, part of the old hoisting system, swung down from the ceiling in a wide arc and caught the soldier across the shoulder and the side of his head. He stumbled sideways. The torch flew from his hand and landed in a puddle, sputtering and dying. In the sudden near darkness, Elindra was already moving. She closed the distance between them in 2 steps, grabbed the knife from his belt before he could regain his balance, and pressed the flat of the blade against his throat. Her hand was shaking. Her whole body was shaking. The adrenaline coursing through her veins made the world vibrate at a frequency she had never experienced before. Everything too sharp, too bright, too loud. The soldier's breathing and her own breathing, and the twin heartbeats inside her belly, all pounding in different rhythms that somehow merged into a single, deafening roar. But the blade did not waver. She held it steady through sheer will, through the same force that had carried her up the hillside and through the birch trees and into this ruined mill, the force that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that she was the only thing standing between her children and a world that wanted to erase them. "Make a sound," she whispered, "and it will be the last sound you ever make. Do you understand me?" The soldier stared at her, at the knife, at the swollen belly between them, rising and falling with each ragged breath. He was young, close up, even younger than she had guessed. 20 at most. A boy playing at soldier, following orders he probably did not fully understand, sent by a woman he had probably never questioned. Something in his expression shifted. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The sudden, uncomfortable understanding that the person in front of him was not a traitor or a criminal, or any of the things he had been told. She was a pregnant woman with a stolen knife and nothing left to lose. And there was no version of this encounter that ended well for him. He gave a single, barely perceptible nod. Elindra took his cloak, his water skin, a small pouch of dried meat from his belt. She worked quickly, her hands moving with a precision that surprised her, fingers steady even as the rest of her trembled. Then she looked at him one last time. "Tell Halvara you found nothing. Tell her you searched the mill and it was empty. And then go home. Go home and forget you ever saw me." She did not wait for a response. She grabbed her bag, pulled the stolen cloak around her shoulders, and slipped out the back of the mill into the forest beyond. The trees closed around her like a door shutting. She moved uphill, away from the stream, away from Thornwick, away from the soldiers and the smoke and the sound of Halvara's voice, giving orders that might already include the instruction to widen the search. Branches scratched her face and caught in her hair. Roots snagged her boots. The stolen cloak was too large and dragged on the ground behind her, collecting mud and dead leaves, but she did not stop to adjust it. She could not stop. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant acknowledging the enormity of what had just happened. A soldier had found her. She had attacked him. She had pressed a blade to a man's throat and threatened to kill him, and some part of her, Some part she had never met before tonight had meant it. She walked until the sounds of the village disappeared entirely, until there was nothing but the creak of trees in the wind and the distant call of a bird she could not identify, and the soft, rhythmic crunch of her boots on the forest floor. The sky above the canopy was lightening from black to charcoal to the pale, bruised purple that came just before dawn. Then the cramping returned. Not the mild tightening she had experienced on the hillside. This was deeper, stronger, a fist closing around her womb with deliberate, crushing force, and it did not let go. Elindra doubled over, caught herself against the trunk of a massive oak, and slid down to the ground, her back pressed against the bark, her legs folding beneath her. The pain radiated outward from her center, rolling through her body in a wave that peaked and held and refused to break. No, the word came out as a moan. Not now. Not here. Please. Not like this. She pressed both hands flat against her belly and felt the twins moving beneath her palms. Not the frantic kicking of earlier, but something slower, something that felt like turning, like settling, like two small bodies rearranging themselves in a space that had become too tight. They were not coming, not yet, but they were telling her, in the only language available to them, that her body could not sustain this much longer, that the running and the climbing and the terror and the cold were taking a toll she could not see, but they could feel. "Hold on," she whispered into the dark. Her voice cracked on both words. "Just a little longer. Please. I need you to stay where you are. I need you to wait for me. I know it is cramped. I know it is loud. I know you can hear my heart beating too fast, and I know that frightens you. But I need you to trust me. Just a little longer. We are almost there." The cramping eased, slowly, grudgingly, like a wave pulling back from shore with the clear intention of returning. Elindra sat in the dirt and the cold and the thin pre-dawn light, her back against the oak, her hands on her belly, her breath coming in long, slow pulls that she forced through her teeth like someone counting to 10 before saying something she would regret. She was alone. The realization settled over her with the weight of a physical thing. Not alone the way she had been alone in Arindra's cottage, where there was a fire and a bed and a sharp-eyed old woman who brought her stew and asked her the right questions. This was alone in the absolute sense, the irreducible sense. No walls, no roof, no one within earshot. Just a woman in a forest with a stolen knife and a bag of evidence, and two babies pressing against the inside of her body, like prisoners trying to escape. She had no plan beyond survive. She had no destination beyond away. And the people who wanted her dead were somewhere behind her, close enough that the smell of the barn they had burned still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of pine needles and cold earth and her own sweat. Elindra pressed her face against the rough bark of the oak tree and wept, not quietly, not the controlled, silent tears she had permitted herself during the long nights in Thornwick. These were ugly, wrenching sobs that tore themselves out of her chest like something with claws. Sounds she did not recognize coming from a throat that ached with the accumulated weight of every cry she had swallowed over the past 6 weeks. She cried for the baby shower that had become a tribunal, for the husband who had looked at her with ice instead of love, for the sister-in-law who had smiled while sliding the knife in, for the nursery painted sage green that someone had covered over with cream, for the 2 small lives inside her who deserved to be born into warmth and safety and welcome, not into a forest in the dark with a mother who did not know if she would survive the week. She cried until she was empty. And then something strange happened. The emptiness filled back up. Not with grief, not with fear, with something harder. Something that had been forming in the depths of her for weeks, compressed by pressure and heat the way coal becomes diamond. And it rose through her, now like a column of fire, straightening her spine, steadying her hands, drying her eyes with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun that was just beginning to filter through the canopy above. She wiped her face with the edge of the stolen cloak. She checked the evidence in her bag, each piece accounted for, each document dry and intact. She tightened the strap across her chest. She adjusted the knife in her belt, and she stood up. Her body screamed at her. Every joint, every muscle, every swollen, overtaxed part of her protested the motion. She ignored all of it. She had been listening to pain for months. She was fluent in its language now, and she knew the difference between pain that meant stop and pain that simply meant this is hard. This was hard. But it was not impossible. Nothing was impossible anymore. Orindra found her 3 hours later. Elindra was sitting with her back against the same oak, the evidence bag clutched against her chest with both arms wrapped around it, the soldier's knife balanced across her knees. She had not moved from the spot where she stood up because standing up had been the victory. And her body had informed her, in no uncertain terms, that it was the only victory she would be permitted for the time being. The old woman came through the trees with a walking stick in one hand and a canvas sack over her shoulder, breathing hard from the climb, but otherwise composed, her silver braid swinging behind her like a pendulum. Halvara left empty-handed. Orindra announced, sinking down beside her with a grunt. She searched every cottage, questioned every villager, found nothing except an old woman with bad eyesight and a worse memory who kept asking why there were soldiers in her herb garden. She paused, examined the scratches on Elindra's face and the dirt caked into every fold of her dress. I told them you had fled west toward the border. Bought us a day of head start. Maybe less. She will figure out the lie eventually. A day is enough. Elindra's voice was hoarse, scraped raw from crying and cold, and the effort of screaming silently into the bark of a tree. But it was steady. The kind of steady that comes not from the absence of fear, but from its complete and total acknowledgement. Fear accepted. Fear accounted for, fear set aside because there were more important things to do. A raven arrived while Orindra helped her to her feet and walked her slowly, painfully, toward a safe farmstead on the far side of the hills. It circled twice before landing on a fence post, a scroll tied to its leg with a strip of red cloth that Elindra recognized as Corwin's. Orindra untied the message, read it, then handed it to Elindra without a word. The handwriting was small and urgent, pressed hard into the paper as though Corwin had been writing fast, writing scared, writing in stolen moments between duties that required her to smile and curtsy and pretend she was not feeding information to a woman the crown wanted dead. Thandric found the third scribe. His name is Fenwick. He did not flee like the others. He has been living in the lower city, terrified, waiting for Lysanthia to send someone to silence him the way she silenced Sedwin. Thandric brought him to a private chamber and heard his testimony. Fenwick confessed everything. Lysanthia ordered the scribes to confirm the handwriting match. Those who refused were threatened. Those who cooperated were paid. Fenwick cooperated because Lysanthia told him his wife and daughter would be removed from their home and thrown into the streets if he did not sign his name to the analysis. Thandric knows. He knows the scribes were compromised. He is asking questions Lysanthia cannot answer, and she can see the doubt spreading through him like a crack in a dam. She is afraid, but fear makes her more dangerous, not less. She has moved the bonding ceremony with Lady Thessaly forward. It was scheduled for the autumn equinox, 6 weeks from your exile. She has accelerated it to the night of the equinox celebration itself, 5 days from now. If the ceremony is completed, your mating bond with Thandric is severed permanently under Valdrin law. Your children lose all legal claim to the bloodline. Your name is struck from the records. Everything you were, everything you built, everything you sacrificed ceases to exist. 5 days, Elindra. That is all you have left. Be careful. Lysanthia knows she is cornered, and cornered animals do not retreat. They attack. The message was unsigned, but it did not need to be. Elindra read it twice, 3 times. Let the words sink through her skin and into the place where her resolve lived. That hard, bright thing at the center of her chest that had been compressed and heated and hardened over 6 weeks of exile until it was denser than anything Lysanthia could throw at it. 5 days. She folded the message carefully, placed it inside her bag next to the evidence, next to the practice sheets and the ink bottle and the note bearing Lysanthia's initials. Next to the knife she had taken from a boy soldier in a ruined mill. Then she looked at Elindra. The old woman looked back, and for the first time since they had met, Elindra did not offer advice, did not raise a sharp eyebrow or make a cutting observation or suggest a more prudent course of action. She simply stood in the morning light with her walking stick in one hand and waited for the woman in front of her to say the words they both already knew were coming. I am done hiding. Elindra nodded once, slowly. Then let us get you to the capital before that golden-haired viper can finish what she started. They began walking east, toward the mountains, toward the palace, toward the great hall where, 5 nights from now, 1,000 candles would blaze for the autumn equinox, and Lysanthia Valdrin would learn, in front of every noble and dignitary and servant and soldier who had ever believed her lies, exactly what happened when you underestimated a mother with nothing left to lose. Elindra pressed her hand against her belly, felt 2 small lives shift beneath her palm. 5 days, she whispered to them. Hold on for 5 more days, and then I will give you the world. The journey to the capital took 3 days. 3 days of traveling through the night and sleeping in borrowed barns during the daylight hours. When the roads were watched and the risk of being recognized grew with every mile closer to the palace, Elindra called in every favor she had accumulated over 7 decades of quiet, stubborn survival. A cart ride from a wool merchant who owed her for a healing tincture she had made for his wife's breathing sickness. A safe house in a coaching inn run by a woman whose daughter Elindra had delivered 30 years ago. A change of clothes from a seamstress in a market town who asked no questions and accepted no payment and simply pressed Elindra's hand and said, "Whatever you are running toward, I hope you find it." A network of ordinary people, farmers and traders and innkeepers and midwives, people who had never set foot inside a palace and never would, people who saw everything and were seen by nothing, who passed through the world without leaving marks, and who understood, in some bone-deep and instinctive way, that a pregnant woman traveling alone with terror in her eyes and steel in her spine was someone worth helping. Elindra did not waste the travel time. In the back of the wool merchant's cart, Jolting over rutted roads with her back braced against a bale and the evidence spread across her lap, she worked. Not just reviewing the documents she already had, but building something larger. A case, a structure, an argument so tight and so logical that no amount of Lysanthia's silk tongue deflection could unpick its seams. She organized the evidence chronologically. Sedwin Hallow's practice sheets showing the progressive refinement of her forged handwriting, dated by the aging of the ink. The note bearing Lysanthia's initials and her instruction to destroy everything upon completion. The bottle of iron gall ink, premium formulation, matching the specific blend Elindra had identified in the forged letters through her knowledge of calligraphy and ink composition, and her own analysis, written out in her careful hand, explaining how the absence of her moon circle signature on every single forged letter proved that whoever had written them did not know her well enough to replicate the one detail that mattered most. She wrote and rewrote her presentation until the words flowed like water down a slope, each point leading inevitably to the next, each piece of evidence reinforcing the others until the whole structure was as solid and immovable as stone. She was not just going to accuse Lysanthia. She was going to dismantle her, brick by brick, lie by lie, until there was nothing left but the truth standing naked in the torchlight for every person in that hall to see. On the second day, word reached them through the network. The Alpha King has grown erratic. The message came from a stable hand who carried gossip between coaching inns the way other men carried mail, snapping at advisors, dismissing servants for minor infractions, spending hours alone in his chambers. He canceled the council session yesterday and refused to see the Southern Isles delegation. Princess Thessaly was seen leaving his private audience chamber looking troubled. Guilt, Arindra said with grim satisfaction. It is eating him from the inside. Elindra said nothing. She was thinking about the journal, about Thandric sitting in the dark in her old chambers, reading letters she had written to their unborn child, noticing the moon circle on every page, and then looking at the forged letters and finding it absent. She was thinking about Fenwick's confession, about the cracks spreading through the wall of certainty that Lysanthia had so carefully constructed around her brother's mind. He was starting to doubt, but doubt was not the same as belief, and belief was not the same as action. She could not rely on Thandric to save her. She had learned that lesson the hard way, standing in a great hall with divorce papers at her feet and 100 witnesses to her humiliation. If she was going to be saved, she would save herself. On the evening of the third day, they reached the outskirts of the capital. The city sprawled across the valley below them, and above it, crowning the highest hill like a fist raised against the sky, the palace of Valdrin blazed with light. Every window was illuminated. Torches lined the approach road in twin ribbons of fire. The autumn equinox celebration was already underway. Carriages streamed through the main gates, carrying nobles in silk and velvet and fur, and the distant sound of music drifted up the hillside like a ghost of happier times. Elindra stood on the ridge with her hood pulled low and one hand pressed to the small of her aching back and looked at the place that had been her home. The place that had cast her out. The place she was about to walk back into uninvited, 8 months pregnant, carrying evidence that would destroy the most powerful woman in the kingdom. In a few hours, everything would change. Either she would reclaim her name, her children's legacy, and her rightful place, or Lysanthia would finish what she had started, and Elindra would disappear forever. There was no middle ground, no partial victory, no room for failure. She touched the bag of evidence beneath her cloak and began the descent toward the palace gates. The meeting with Corwin happened in a servant's passage behind the kitchens, in a narrow corridor that smelled of roasting meat and spilled wine and the sharp metallic scent of anxiety. Corwin looked like she had not slept in days. Her round face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she pulled Elindra into a fierce embrace that lasted several seconds longer than either of them had time for. "You are alive," Corwin whispered against her shoulder. "Thank every god that ever was. You are alive." When Halvara came back empty-handed, Lysanthia was furious. She doubled the patrols on every road within 50 miles. "I was terrified they had found you, and I simply had not been told. I am here." Elindra pulled back, gripping Corwin's shoulders. "And I need to know everything. What is happening in that hall tonight? What has Lysanthia planned?" Corwin's expression darkened. She guided Elindra deeper into the passage, away from the kitchen noise, into a small storage alcove where they could speak without being overheard. "The bonding ceremony with Lady Thessaly is scheduled for midnight. After the feast, after the equinox rituals, Lysanthia has arranged for the court priest to perform the bond severance first, officially dissolving your connection to Thandric, and then immediately conducting the new bonding with Thessaly. She wants it done publicly, in front of every noble house, every foreign dignitary, every person who matters. Once it is complete, your children have no claim. Your marriage never existed. You become nothing." Elindra absorbed this in silence. Then she asked the question that mattered most. "Fenwick, the scribe who confessed to Thandric, where is he?" Corwin's face tightened. "Still in the capital. Thandric had him moved to a secure room in the East Wing after the confession, but Lysanthia has been trying to get access to him for days. She has not succeeded yet, but she knows he talked. She knows the wall is crumbling. That is why she accelerated the ceremony." Elindra said slowly, fitting the pieces together. "She is running out of time. If Thandric has enough doubt to investigate, he might have enough doubt to stop the bonding, so she needs the ceremony to happen before his doubt becomes certainty." "Yes," Corwin agreed, "but there is something else. Lysanthia has a contingency. If you appear tonight, if you somehow make it into that hall and present evidence against her, she will not deny the letters exist. She will claim that you are the one who hired Sedwin Hallow, that you commissioned the forgeries yourself as part of an elaborate scheme to frame her and regain your position. And then she will point to Sedwin's death and suggest that you had him killed to eliminate the only person who could contradict your version of events." The accusation was so perfectly constructed that Elindra felt a momentary spike of something that might have been admiration if it had not been directed at the woman who had destroyed her life. Lysanthia had thought of everything, every angle, every counter-argument, every possible move on the board and 3 moves beyond it, almost everything. "I need Fenwick in that hall tonight," Elindra said. "Not hidden away in the East Wing, standing in front of the court, in front of Lysanthia, telling every person present exactly who gave him his orders and exactly how she threatened his family to ensure his compliance. Lysanthia can spin theories about Sedwin all she wants, but she cannot explain away a living witness who will look her in the eye and name her." Corwin stared at her. "That is incredibly dangerous. If Lysanthia's people intercept Fenwick before he reaches the hall, then we make sure they do not." Elindra's voice was calm, calmer than she felt, calmer than she had any right to feel, standing in a storage alcove with her back aching and her babies kicking, and less than 4 hours between now and the moment that would define the rest of her life. "Can you get him there?" A long pause. Corwin swallowed hard. "I know the servants' passages better than anyone in this palace. I can bring him through the old wine cellars and up through the gallery entrance behind the east tapestry. Lysanthia does not know that Root exists, but Elindra, the timing has to be perfect. If he appears too early, before you have presented the physical evidence, Lysanthia will have time to discredit him. He needs to arrive at the exact moment she makes her counter-accusation. When she claims you hired Sedwin, that is when Fenwick's testimony will have the most devastating impact." Elindra nodded. She had already thought of this. She had been thinking of nothing else for 3 days, turning the confrontation over and over in her mind like a jeweler examining a stone for flaws. There was one more thing she needed to do. She reached into her bag and pulled out a sheet of paper, blank, clean. She borrowed a quill from Corwin's apron pocket and a pot of ink from the storage shelf, and she sat down on an overturned crate and began to write. The letter was short, 3 lines, addressed to Thandric, written in her own hand, with all its familiar loops and angles and the particular way she crossed her letter T slightly higher than standard script dictated. And at the bottom, beneath her name, she drew a small circle, a crescent moon, their private signature, the mark that appeared on every note she had ever written him, every love letter, every scribbled reminder left on his desk, every page of the journal he had found in her empty chambers, if he still remembered. If there was anything left of the man who had sat in a tavern drinking cheap ale and falling in love with a woman who did not know he was a king. If that man still existed somewhere beneath the pride and the grief and the months of Lysanthia's poison, he would know this letter was real. Give this to him. She handed it to Corwin. Not now. After I enter the hall. After I present the evidence. When everything is chaos and Lysanthia is screaming and the court does not know what to believe. Put this in his hand. Let him see the moon circle. Let him remember. Corwin took the letter with shaking fingers, tucked it inside her bodice, and then she did something unexpected. She cupped Elindra's face in both hands and looked at her with an expression that contained so many emotions, it was impossible to separate them. Pride, terror, love. The particular kind of grief that comes from watching someone you care about walk toward a door that might not lead anywhere good. You are going to be magnificent, Corwin whispered, and terrifying. And I am going to cry through the entire thing. Then bring a handkerchief. Elindra almost smiled. And make sure Fenwick is ready. The great hall blazed with light. 1,000 candles glittered from iron chandeliers and wall sconces, casting golden shadows across silk gowns and jeweled throats and the polished stone floor that reflected the flames like a dark mirror. The cream of Valdrin society had gathered to celebrate the equinox, to drink the Alpha King's wine, to dance to music played by an orchestra that cost more per evening than most families earned in a year. Crystal goblets caught the candlelight and threw tiny fractures of color across every surface. The air was thick with perfume and roasted meat and the sharp undercurrent of political ambition that flavored every gathering of the powerful. And there, seated at the high table on a chair carved from black oak and draped in crimson silk, was Lysanthia. She wore red tonight, blood red. A gown of silk so deeply colored it seemed to absorb the light around it, making her golden hair glow like a halo, and her skin luminous, and her smile radiant with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believed she had already won. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said, tilting her head at precisely the right angle, touching her throat with precisely the right degree of casual elegance. Every gesture calculated, every expression curated. The perfect portrait of a princess in her element. Beside her sat Lady Thessaly. The Southern Isles princess occupied the chair that should have been Elindra's. She wore deep blue, almost black, and her dark hair was pinned with sapphires that caught the candlelight like fallen stars. She was beautiful in the way that political alliances required their participants to be beautiful, polished, and composed, and entirely, deliberately unremarkable in any way that might overshadow the woman seated next to her. She was watching the room with intelligent, careful eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. And Thandric. Elindra forgot to breathe when she saw him. He sat on his throne at the center of the high table, and he looked like a man who was being slowly hollowed out from the inside. Gaunt, sharp in all the wrong places, cheekbones too prominent, jaw too tight, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with weeks of sleeplessness. He held a goblet of wine that he had not touched. He wore the black and silver of the Valdrin kings, but the clothes hung on him as though they had been fitted for a larger man, a man who ate and slept and smiled, a man who still inhabited his own body instead of just haunting it. This was not a man celebrating. This was not a man enjoying his victory or anticipating a new bond or looking forward to anything at all. This was a man sitting in the ruins of something he had destroyed with his own hands, and the rubble was finally settling, and he was beginning to see, for the first time, the shape of what he had lost. Elindra pushed through the crowd. Her hood was still raised. Her stolen cloak covered her gown and her belly and her face. She was one shadow among many, slipping between nobles who were too absorbed in their own conversations and their own intrigues to notice a cloaked figure moving with quiet purpose toward the center of the hall. She was almost there when a hand closed around her arm. The grip was strong, practiced, the kind of grip that knew exactly how much pressure to apply to control without bruising, because bruises left evidence, and evidence was inconvenient. I knew you would come. Halvara's voice was low, almost intimate, spoken directly into Elindra's ear from behind. The words carried the warmth of someone greeting an old friend, and the intent of someone tightening a noose. Lysanthia said you would not be able to resist. She said your pride would bring you back even when your survival instinct should have kept you away. I see she was right. She always is. Let go of me. I do not think I will. Halvara's fingers tightened. She was taller than Elindra by half a head and stronger, and she was not 8 months pregnant with twins. You are going to come with me. Quietly. We are going to walk together through the side corridor, down the east staircase, and into a room where we can have a private conversation. No witnesses, no interruptions. Just you and me and the questions Lysanthia would like answered before this evening's festivities conclude. Elindra did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the high table, on Thandric, on the man who did not yet know she was 20 feet away from him, carrying the truth he had been too proud and too wounded to seek for himself. I will ask you once more. Elindra's voice was quiet. Remove your hand. Halvara laughed softly. Or what? You will scream? 'Cause a scene? In a hall full of people who believe you are a disgraced traitor? Who do you think they will side with? The banished Luna or the princess's personal guard? Elindra considered this for approximately 2 seconds. Then she turned her body sharply, using the momentum to break Halvara's grip on her arm. In the same motion, she drove her elbow backward into the soft space just below Halvara's sternum. Not a polished move. Not a trained move. The clumsy, desperate, effective strike of a woman who had spent 6 weeks learning that survival was not graceful and did not need to be. Halvara doubled over with a grunt of surprise and pain. Her grip vanished, and Elindra did not hesitate. She pulled free, stumbled forward on legs that ached and ankles that throbbed and a body that screamed at her with every step, and she threw back her hood. Thandric. Her voice rang out across the great hall like a bell struck in an empty church. The music stopped. Every conversation died. Every head in the room turned toward the center of the floor where a woman stood, cloaked and travel-stained, her dark hair loose around a face that half the room recognized and the other half had only heard about in whispers and rumors, and the particular kind of gossip that traveled through palaces like fire through dry grass. Elindra pushed the cloak back from her shoulders and let it fall. Her pregnant belly, huge and unmistakable at 8 months with twins, was visible to every person in the hall. She held the evidence high in one hand, papers and a glass bottle and the weight of 6 weeks of exile and investigation and survival clutched in fingers that did not tremble. I have proof that I was framed. Her voice carried to every corner of the hall, clear and steady and shaking with a controlled fury that was more devastating than shouting could ever have been. Proof that the letters were forged. Proof that the scribes were bribed and threatened. Proof that every accusation made against me was manufactured by someone in this room. Someone who sits at that table tonight. Someone who has been lying to the Alpha King and to this court, and to every person in this kingdom since the day she decided that a common girl from a border village did not deserve to be loved. Chaos erupted. Guards surged forward from the walls. Nobles gasped and stumbled backward, pulling their partners behind them. Goblets crashed to the floor. The orchestra abandoned their instruments. Lady Thessaly rose from her chair with an expression of sharp, startled alertness that suggested she understood exactly what was happening, even if she had not expected it to happen tonight. Lysanthia shot to her feet. The crimson gown swirled around her like blood in water as she turned to face Elindra across the length of the hall. Her golden hair caught the candlelight. Her face contorted, the mask of sweetness cracking to reveal something feral and desperate underneath. Seize her. Lysanthia's voice pitched high, almost a scream. She is delusional. She is dangerous. She attacked a guard to enter this hall. She is a banished exile who has violated the terms of her expulsion. Guards, remove her immediately. Stop. Thandric's voice cut through the chaos like a blade through water. He was standing. Elindra had not seen him rise. One moment he was seated on his throne, the next he was on his feet, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen before. Not anger, not the cold, certain fury that had driven him to throw divorce papers at her feet 6 weeks ago. This was something rawer, more fractured. Shock and hope and anguish braided together so tightly that the seams between them had disappeared. Let her speak. His voice was not steady. It was not the voice of a king issuing a command. It was the voice of a man standing on the edge of something he was terrified to look at. Brother? Lysanthia's tone shifted, became urgent, pleading, the voice of a concerned sister protecting her family. She is clearly disturbed. The exile has broken her mind. Whatever she claims to have, It is fabricated. You cannot possibly give credence to. I said let her speak. His eyes had not left Elindra's face, not for a single second. Not when Lysanthia screamed, not when the guards advanced, not when the entire hall descended into pandemonium around him. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the surface of the water, with desperation and disbelief and the terrible, aching possibility that air might still exist. Guards, stand down. Now. The guards hesitated, looked at Lysanthia, looked at the king, and obeyed. Elindra walked forward. Every step hurt. Her back, her hips, her ankles. The twins pressing down inside her with a weight that made each stride feel like walking through chest-deep water. She could feel every eye in the hall tracking her movement, could hear the whispers spreading through the crowd like wind through wheat, a rising murmur of shock and fascination and the particular electricity that fills a room when every person in it understands they are witnessing something that will be talked about for years. She stopped at the foot of the high table, looked up at the man who had shattered her heart, and held out the papers. Read these. Her voice did not shake. She was beyond shaking, beyond fear, beyond everything except the truth and the children inside her and the iron certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Practice sheets in my handwriting, created by a forger named Sedwin Hallow, a disgraced scribe dismissed from the royal archives, who was paid handsomely to replicate my penmanship and produce the letters you believed were evidence of my infidelity. She laid each document on the table before him as she spoke, precise and methodical. A note in your sister's own hand, instructing Sedwin to destroy all evidence after payment was received, signed with her initials, SV. A bottle of Iron Gall ink, premium formulation, the exact blend used in the forgeries, purchased by Sedwin from a specialty merchant in the capital 6 months ago, traceable through the Merchant Guild's records. And my own analysis of the ink composition cross-referenced with samples from the forged letters, proving that the same hand and the same materials produced every piece of correspondence you used to justify destroying my life. Thandric took the papers. His hands were unsteady. The great hall was silent now, a silence so complete that Elindra could hear the candles guttering in their sconces, and the faint, rhythmic pulse of her own heartbeat, and the soft, desperate sound of Thandric's breathing as he read. She watched his face transform, confusion first, then disbelief. A brief, convulsive flash of denial, the mind's last attempt to protect itself from a truth too painful to absorb. And then, slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape of devastation, understanding. Horrified, nauseating, irreversible understanding. These are Lysanthia's words. His voice was barely audible, hoarse with something that went beyond shock into a territory that did not have a name. This is her handwriting. I have seen it on 1,000 letters, 1,000 notes, every birthday, every council briefing. This is my sister's hand. He looked up at Lysanthia, and Elindra saw the exact moment his heart broke for the second time. Lies. Lysanthia stepped forward. Her composure was fracturing, but she was not done. Not yet. She had planned for this. She had contingencies. Her voice rang out across the hall, strong and clear and vibrating with righteous conviction. She fabricated those documents. She hired Sedwin Hallow herself, used him to create the forgeries, then murdered him to ensure his silence. This is a desperate woman's desperate scheme to reclaim a position she never deserved. Do not be fooled by her theatrics, brother. She is manipulating you. She has always manipulated you. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. The accusation was plausible. That was the terrifying thing about Lysanthia. Her lies always wore the clothes of reason. A common-born woman, desperate to hold on to her elevated status, hiring a forger to frame her sister-in-law and then eliminating the only witness. It was the kind of story that people wanted to believe because it confirmed what they had already decided about women who married above their station. Elindra felt the room tilt, felt the doubt ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. And she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a happy smile. The cold, sharp, patient smile of a woman who had spent 3 days in the back of a wool merchant's cart preparing for exactly this moment. She turned to face the east wall of the great hall, where a heavy tapestry depicting the Valdrin ancestral hunt hung from ceiling to floor. "Now," she said. The tapestry moved. A section of it pushed outward from behind, and through the hidden gallery entrance that only the servants knew existed, 2 figures emerged. Corwin, pale-faced and trembling but standing straight, and beside her, a thin, anxious man in his middle years with ink-stained fingers and the hunted look of someone who had been living in fear for months. He blinked in the sudden blaze of candlelight, swallowed hard, and then he straightened his spine and looked directly at Lysanthia. Fenwick, the scribe, the witness, the one loose end that Lysanthia had not managed to tie off, because Thandric had found him first. "My name is Fenwick Ashmore." His voice shook, but it carried. "I served in the Royal Archives for 11 years. 6 weeks ago, I was summoned to the private chambers of Princess Lysanthia Valdrin and instructed to sign a document confirming that a set of letters matched the handwriting of Luna Elindra. I was not permitted to perform an independent analysis. The conclusion was predetermined. When I expressed reservations, the princess informed me that my wife and young daughter would be removed from their home and exiled to the Northern Territories if I did not comply. 2 of my colleagues received similar threats. Those who cooperated were paid. Those who would not were threatened. I signed my name because I believed Lysanthia Valdrin would destroy my family if I refused." He paused, drew a breath that rattled in his chest. The letters were forgeries. I knew it then. I have confirmed it since in private testimony to the Alpha King himself. And I stand before this court tonight to state, under oath and without coercion, that Princess Lysanthia Valdrin orchestrated the fabrication of evidence against her own brother's mate for the sole purpose of removing her from the throne. The silence that followed was not like the silence that had fallen when Elindra entered the hall. That silence had been shock. This silence was something else entirely. This was the silence of a room full of people collectively understanding that the ground beneath their feet had shifted, that the story they had believed for 6 weeks was a lie, and that the woman in the crimson gown who had smiled so sweetly and spoken so convincingly was not what they had thought she was. Lysanthia stared at Fenwick. The color drained from her face in stages, like water receding from a shore. "No." The word came out, strangled. "No, this is not. He is lying. She paid him. She coerced him. This is part of her scheme, brother. You must see that this is..." She was unraveling. Elindra watched it happen with a detachment that surprised her. She had imagined this moment 100 times during the long nights in Thornwick, during the cramped hours in the wool cart, during the cold, terrified minutes in the ruined mill. She had imagined rage, imagined triumph, imagined the searing satisfaction of watching Lysanthia's empire of lies crumble. What she felt instead was something quieter, something that ached, Because Lysanthia was not just a villain unmasked. She was a woman whose mother had died when she was 8 years old. A woman who had raised her brother, who had clung to the only role that gave her value, protector, advisor, the most important woman in Thandric's life, and who had watched that role evaporate the day a common girl from a border village made her brother laugh in a way Lysanthia never could. It did not excuse what she had done. Nothing could excuse what she had done, but Alindra understood it, and that understanding made the moment heavier than triumph ever could. Lysanthia's composure shattered completely. The mask fell away, and what was underneath was not beautiful or calculated or composed. It was raw, desperate, the face of someone cornered and terrified and lashing out in the only direction left. She was an obstacle. Lysanthia screamed, and the words echoed off the stone walls of the great hall and bounced back like something thrown. A common nobody who bewitched you into forgetting your duty. The Southern Isles Alliance would have made us the most powerful kingdom on the continent. The heirs she carries would have diluted our bloodline. I was protecting you. I was protecting our legacy. I was protecting everything our mother built before she died. I was protecting you. The confession hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, heard by every noble, every servant, every foreign dignitary and trade ambassador and member of the court who had gathered to celebrate the equinox, and instead witnessed the unraveling of a conspiracy that had been woven so tightly into the fabric of the kingdom that pulling on one thread brought the entire tapestry down. Lysanthia seemed to realize what she had said approximately 3 seconds after the words left her mouth. Her face went white. Paper white. The white of someone who has just watched themselves step off a cliff and is suspended in the moment before gravity remembers they exist. Guards. Thandric's voice came from somewhere very far away and very deep. From the bottom of something that had collapsed. Take my sister to the tower. She will await trial for treason, conspiracy against the crown, and the attempted murder of the Luna of Valdrin. You cannot do this. Lysanthia struggled as the guards gripped her arms. Her golden hair fell across her face, and the crimson gown twisted around her legs, and she looked nothing like the poised, radiant princess who had sat at the high table an hour ago. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman watching the consequences of her own choices close around her like a fist. I am your blood, Thandric, your only family. I raised you. I held you when Mother died. I gave up everything for you. Everything. No. Thandric looked at his sister, and the devastation in his face was total. His iron gray eyes were wet. His voice cracked on the single syllable. You stopped being my family the moment you betrayed my mate. The moment you put forged letters in my hand and watched me destroy the woman I loved and did nothing. Nothing, Lysanthia. You stood there and you watched and you did nothing. Lysanthia was dragged from the hall. Her screams echoed off the stone walls, through the corridors, up the staircases, growing fainter and thinner until they dissolved into silence. And the silence remained. Heavy. Total. The silence of something ending. The great hall emptied slowly. Nobles fled to their chambers to gossip. Servants scurried through side doors to spread the news through every kitchen and stable and servants' quarter in the palace. The orchestra gathered their instruments and left without being dismissed. Lady Thessaly was escorted away by her chaperone, the Southern Isles delegation already calculating the political cost of an alliance that had crumbled before it was ever formalized. Thessaly paused at the door, turned, found Elindra across the length of the hall, and gave a single, slow nod. Not sympathy, not pity, recognition. One woman acknowledging another, the quiet, unmistakable respect of someone who understood exactly what it cost to stand alone in a room full of enemies and refuse to be silent. Then she was gone, and only two people remained in the great hall of Valdrin, standing on opposite sides of a distance that could not be measured in feet, Elindra and Thandric. He came down from the high table, slowly, each step deliberate, as though the floor might give way beneath him. He stopped 6 feet from her, the same distance he had kept on the day he threw the divorce papers. But everything else was different. His posture, his eyes, the way he held his hands at his sides, open and empty, offering nothing, demanding nothing, simply standing before her as a man stripped of every pretense and every defense and every wall he had ever built. Elindra. His voice broke on her name, fractured into pieces that fell between them like shards of something that had once been whole. I do not know where to begin. Do not. She held up one hand, surprised by how steady it was, how calm, how completely, utterly, impossibly still. Do not apologize yet. I need you to understand what you did to me first. He flinched, but he did not look away. Tell me. You humiliated me in front of every person I had ever known. The words came slowly, each one a stone she had been carrying for 6 weeks, worn smooth by handling, heavy with accumulated weight. You called our children bastards. You threw me out with nothing. No money, no protection, no explanation beyond your sister's lies. I walked for 4 days with our babies inside me. I slept in barns. I ate scraps. I was so exhausted, I collapsed on the side of a road, and a stranger had to lift me into a cart. His face had gone gray, the color of ash, the color of the sky before a storm that knows it will destroy everything beneath it. 3 days ago, Elindra continued, your sister sent soldiers to the village where I was hiding. They had orders to make sure I never spoke again. I ran through the hills in the dark, 8 months pregnant, and hid in a ruined mill while they searched for me. I fought a soldier with a rope and a stolen knife. I lay in a forest alone in the cold, and begged our children not to come early, because if they had been born that night, in that place, without help, they might not have survived. And neither might I. Thandric's breath left him in a sound that was not quite a gasp, and not quite a sob. Something between, something worse. I did not know. The words came out strangled, torn from somewhere deep. Elindra, I swear to you, I did not know she sent. You did not ask. Her voice rose, not to a shout. Something more controlled than that. Something more devastating. You did not investigate. You did not question. You did not give me one single moment to defend myself before you destroyed my entire life. You had the moon circle. You had every note I ever wrote you. You had 2 years of knowing exactly who I am. And you chose to believe forged letters over the woman who loved you so completely that she left behind every piece of her old life to build a new one with you. You were so certain, so absolutely convinced, so proud, that you could not even consider the possibility that you were wrong. Silence. Thandric sank to his knees. The Alpha King, the most powerful man in the realm, knelt on the cold stone floor of the great hall with tears streaming down his face and his hands empty and his eyes holding nothing back. No walls, no pride, no iron. Just a man on his knees in front of the woman he had failed in every way that mattered. You are right. His voice was a whisper. I failed you. I let my fear and my pride convince me that the woman I loved, the woman who never gave me a single reason to doubt her, had somehow betrayed me. I believed a lie because the truth was too frightening. Because if you were faithful, if those letters were forged, then it meant someone I trusted, someone I loved, had done something unforgivable. And I was not brave enough to face that. So I punished you instead. He reached toward her hand, then stopped, as if afraid she would recoil from his touch, as if he no longer believed he had the right to touch her at all. I am not asking you to forgive me. I do not deserve it. But please, please, Elindra, let me try to make this right. Let me spend the rest of my life earning back what I destroyed. Elindra looked down at him, at this man on his knees, this man who had kissed her forehead on the morning of the baby shower and told her he loved her. This man who had read her journal in the dark and noticed the missing moon circles and still not been brave enough to act until the evidence walked into his hall and forced him to see. She reached into the folds of her cloak and found the letter she had written, the one she had given to Corwin, that Corwin had pressed into Thandric's hand in the chaos. He was holding it, she realized, clutched in his fist, crumpled and tear-stained. She could see the bottom edge, the crescent moon. Stand up, Thandric. Her voice was quiet, firm, not cold, not warm. Something in between that was entirely, uniquely hers. He rose slowly, his eyes red, his face ravaged, the face of a man who understood, finally, what he had lost and what it would cost to rebuild. You are not my husband, she said. Not yet. Not until you have earned it. But you are the father of my children. And I believe, I have to believe, that the man I married is still inside you somewhere. So prove it. Not with words, not with apologies, with time, with patience, with every day from this one forward. She placed her hand over his heart, felt it slamming against her palm, desperate and terrified and alive. Start now, she said. Thandric covered her hand with his own and held it there against his chest, as though if he let go, the world would dissolve and take her with it. Whatever you are willing to give. His voice was fierce, raw, broken open and rebuilt in the space of a single breath. I will take it, and I will spend every day showing you that I am worthy of another chance. Elindra studied his face, searched for the cold stranger, found only anguish and love and the desperate, fragile, determined hope of a man who knew he had been given something he did not deserve and was terrified of wasting it. See that you do. She pulled her hand back, already missing his warmth, already hating herself for missing it. Now help me find somewhere to sit down. Your heirs have been using my ribs as a percussion instrument for the past hour, and I have not slept in 3 days. And if I stand here for one more minute, I am going to collapse on this very expensive floor. A broken, startled, beautiful sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. Of course, anything, everything. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, a moment in which 6 weeks of pain and exile and loneliness and survival balanced against the warmth of his skin and the steadiness of his arm, and the way his iron-gray eyes looked at her like she was the only real thing in a world made of shadows. She took it. They walked out of the great hall together, not as husband and wife, not as Alpha and Luna, not as the people they had been before the envelope landed on the gift table and shattered everything, as two people taking the first fragile, uncertain, painful, necessary steps towards something that might, with enough time and enough courage and enough grace, become whole again. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The twins arrived 3 weeks later, on a night when the moon hung full and heavy over the mountains like a lantern lit by someone who wanted to make sure the world could see what was about to happen. Elindra had been restless all day. A low ache had settled into her back that morning and refused to leave, wrapping around her hips and tightening in waves that grew closer together as the hours passed. She had felt this before in the forest, that terrible night against the oak tree when she had begged her children to wait. They had listened then. They were not listening now. By sundown, she knew. Thandric was there within minutes of being told. He had kept his word about that. About everything, actually, in the 3 weeks since the equinox. He had moved into the adjoining chamber rather than assuming he could return to their shared bed. He had asked permission before entering her rooms. He had not once pressed her for more than she was willing to give, and the restraint clearly cost him something enormous, because she could see it in the way his hands tightened at his sides every time he wanted to reach for her, and stopped himself. But tonight, there was no hesitation. He came through the door still wearing his council coat, ink on his fingers from the documents he had been reviewing, and his face held the particular expression of a man who was trying very hard to be calm and failing comprehensively. The midwife says it could be hours yet. Elindra told him from the bed, where she was propped against a mountain of pillows that Corwin had arranged with architectural precision. You do not need to stay the entire time. I am not leaving this room. He said it the way other men said, I love you. Simply, completely, without room for negotiation. He pulled a chair to her bedside, took her hand, and stayed. The labor lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of contractions that started slow and deep and built to a crescendo that tore sounds from Elindra's throat she did not recognize. Sounds that were older than language and more honest than anything she had ever spoken. Thandric held her hand through every one of them. He wiped the sweat from her forehead with a cloth he kept dipping in cool water. He whispered encouragement when she screamed that she could not do this anymore, that it was too much, that her body was splitting apart and she was not strong enough. You are the strongest person I have ever known, he told her, and his voice did not waver. Though his face was pale and his eyes were bright with tears, he refused to let fall, because this was not his pain to cry about. You fought soldiers and survived exile and walked back into a palace full of enemies and made them listen. You can do this. You are doing this. I am right here. I am not going anywhere. The first cry pierced the air just after midnight. High and thin and furious, the outraged wail of a tiny creature pulled from warmth and darkness into the cold, bright shock of the world. The midwife lifted the baby, red-faced and squalling. A boy. And Elindra reached for him with arms that shook from exhaustion and felt the weight of him settle against her chest, like an answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. Then the second contraction hit, sharper than anything before, and 12 minutes later, a second cry joined the first. A girl, smaller than her brother but louder, her lungs announcing her arrival with a determination that made the midwife laugh and say, "That one will be trouble." Elindra looked down at her children. The boy had dark hair already, a shock of it standing up in every direction, and he had stopped crying the moment he was placed against her skin, his tiny hand curling into a fist around the fabric of her nightgown. The girl was still making her feelings about the world known at considerable volume, her face scrunched and furious, her jaw set in a way that Elindra recognized instantly because she saw it in the mirror every morning. "Rowan," she said softly, touching the boy's cheek. And Lyraveth, the names she had whispered to them during the long nights in Thornwick, the names she had given them in the forest, pressed against an oak tree, begging them to hold on. Thandric knelt beside the bed. His iron-gray eyes moved between the three of them, between Elindra and their son and their daughter, and his face held an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the composed authority of a king, not the controlled tenderness of a husband. Something larger, something that cracked him open and let all the light in. They are beautiful. His voice was rough, wrecked. The voice of a man feeling something so big, it had nowhere to go except out. You are beautiful. All of you. They have your eyes. Elindra traced the curve of Lyraveth's ear, still damp and impossibly small. Poor things. A startled, broken laugh escaped him. Did you just insult me while holding our newborn children? Someone has to keep you humble. But she was smiling. A real smile. The first one that reached all the way to her eyes in months. Thandric reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. His hand hovered above Rowan's head, trembling, as though touching his own son required permission he was not certain he had earned. Elindra took his hand and placed it gently on the baby's back. Thandric's breath caught. She watched his fingers spread across the tiny span of his son's body, feeling the warmth of him, the impossible smallness, the steady, quick rhythm of a heart the size of a walnut beating against his palm. And the tears he had been holding back for 9 hours finally fell, silently, without sound, running down his face and dropping onto the blankets while he knelt there with his hand on his son's back, and the understanding of what he had almost lost settling over him like snowfall. The seasons turned. Lysanthia's trial was swift and devastating. The evidence was overwhelming. Her own words and her own initials and the testimony of a scribe she had threatened and a forger she had paid and then silenced permanently. The council deliberated for less than a day, guilty on all counts: treason, conspiracy against the crown, attempted murder of the Luna, the murder of Sedwyn Hallow, ordered if not executed by her own hand. Thandric wanted execution. He said so quietly, in the private chamber where he and Elindra discussed the sentencing. His voice was flat and his eyes were empty, and she understood, looking at him, that this was not cruelty. It was the howl of a man who had been betrayed by the person he trusted most in the world, and did not know what to do with the wreckage except burn it. Exile, Elindra said. He looked at her. I do not want our children to grow up knowing their father executed their aunt, and I do not want to become the person Lysanthia believed I was. Someone who claws and schemes and destroys to protect their position. She paused. Your mother asked her to take care of you. She twisted that into something poisonous. But the original impulse, the love underneath the corruption, that was real. Let her live with the knowledge of what she turned it into. That is a worse punishment than death. Thandric stared at her for a long time, and then he nodded. Not because he agreed, because he had promised to trust her judgment, and because he was learning, slowly, painfully, that strength and mercy were not opposing forces. They were the same force, expressed in different directions. Lysanthia was stripped of her title, her lands, her name, exiled to a fortress on the frozen northern border, where she would spend the rest of her days in comfortable but absolute isolation. When the guards led her from the council chamber, she passed within 3 feet of Elindra. She stopped, turned, and looked at the woman she had tried to destroy with an expression Elindra had never seen on her face before. Not hatred, not fury, not the golden poison smile, bewilderment. She genuinely did not understand why Elindra had spared her, and perhaps that, more than anything else, was the saddest part of the entire story. That Lysanthia had lived her whole life so steeped in the logic of power and threat and elimination that the concept of mercy was literally incomprehensible to her. Later, when the fortress was searched as part of the proceedings, they found the hidden compartment in Lysanthia's writing desk, the false bottom that concealed a single letter, yellowed with age, written in a hand that had been still for decades. Lysanthia's mother, her last words to her daughter, written in the weeks before she died. "Take care of your brother, my darling. You are his heart. Never let anyone come between the two of you. Promise me. Promise me you will always protect him." Elindra read the letter in the quiet of her chambers, with Rowan asleep on her chest and Lyriveth making small discontented noises in the cradle beside her. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and placed it in a box she kept on her writing desk. Not to use. Not to weaponize, just to remember that monsters were not born. They were made, one wound at a time, one distortion at a time, one small, desperate act of love twisted slowly into something unrecognizable. Months later, a trader passing through the northern territories brought word of a woman in a stone fortress on the edge of the frozen wastes. She had golden hair that she no longer bothered to brush. She wore gray wool instead of crimson silk. She swept the floors of her own chambers because there were no servants to do it for her, only guards who brought meals at fixed hours and spoke to her only when necessary. She stood at her window each morning and looked out at a landscape of ice and rock and sky so vast and so empty that it made the walls of her gilded prison feel like the inside of a coffin. She did not scream anymore. She did not rage. She simply existed, suspended in the particular silence that comes when a person has run out of people to manipulate and discovered that without an audience, they do not know who they are. That same morning, 1,000 miles south, Elindra sat in the palace garden with Rowan on her lap, and Lyriveth asleep in the cradle beside her. Corwin was laughing at something the cook had said. Sunlight fell through the wisteria in warm, shifting patterns across the stone bench, and the air smelled of white jasmine and fresh bread and the clean, powdery scent of her children's skin. A butterfly landed on Rowan's outstretched fist, and he stared at it with his father's iron-gray eyes, wide and astonished, as though the world had just presented him with its most magnificent secret. Elindra did not think about Lysanthia often, but when she did, she felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a quiet, complicated ache. The kind you feel when you remember that the person who tried to destroy you was once a child who lost her mother and never learned how to grieve without turning grief into a weapon. She kissed her son's dark hair and let it go. The courting began gently. Thandric did not rush. He had been a man accustomed to commanding, to deciding, to having the world arrange itself according to his will. Learning to wait, to earn, to offer without expectation was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than governing, harder than battle, harder than kneeling on a stone floor and admitting he had been wrong. He learned what flowers she loved and filled her chambers with them every morning. White jasmine, the same flowers from the baby shower, a reclamation. He remembered every food she craved and ensured the kitchens had it ready before she asked. He took the night feedings without complaint, walking the corridors with Rowan or Lyriveth pressed against his chest, humming off key lullabies that the babies seemed to tolerate out of politeness more than genuine appreciation. And he listened. Every time Elindra spoke about her pain, her fear, the nightmares that still sometimes jolted her awake, the moments in the forest when she had been certain she would die, he listened without defending himself, without explaining, without redirecting the conversation toward his own suffering. One evening, 3 months after the trial, they stood together on the balcony outside her chambers. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of blood and gold that had colored it on the night she was exiled. Rowan and Laraveth were sleeping in the nursery, the sage green nursery that Thandric had repainted himself, on his knees with a brush in his hand and paint in his hair, because he said it needed to be done right and done by him. I was so angry, Elindra said, watching the light change. For months, all I felt was rage. At you, at Lysanthia, at myself for trusting either of you. And now, she considered the question, now I feel tired, hopeful, scared, and something else I am not quite ready to name. He stood beside her, close enough to touch but not touching, giving her space the way he had learned to give her space, with patience that cost him everything and showed nothing. Ask me, she said suddenly. He turned to look at her, his iron gray eyes catching the last of the sunset. Ask you what? The question you have wanted to ask for months. The one you hold back every time you look at me across a room. The one you swallow every night when you say goodnight at my door and walk to your own chamber alone. His breath caught. Elindra. Ask me, Thandric. He faced her fully, drew himself up, and let the walls down completely, every last one, leaving nothing between them but the truth and the fading light. Will you be my wife again? The words came out unsteady, unrehearsed. Nothing like the polished speech of a king, and everything like the raw, terrified hope of a man in a tavern who kept coming back every night because the woman who served the ale made him feel like a person instead of a crown. My Luna, my partner, my mate. Not because of politics or alliance or bloodline. Because I love you. Because I never stopped loving you. Not even when I was too blind and too proud to see the truth. And because if you will have me, I swear, on our children's lives, on every star above this mountain, I will spend every remaining day of my life proving that I am worthy of your trust. Elindra looked at him. This man who had broken her heart so completely, she had thought it would never beat in the right rhythm again. This man who had spent 3 months gathering every fragment, not trying to glue them back together the way they were before, because they could never be what they were before, but building something new from the pieces, something different, something that had cracks in it, visible and honest, but was stronger in the broken places because the material that filled them was not pretense or pride. It was truth, as equals. She said, as partners, no secrets, no assumptions, no letting anyone come between us, ever again. Agreed. His voice broke on the word. Anything. Everything. Elindra reached up and cupped his face in both hands, felt the rough stubble against her palms, and the heat of his skin, and the way his whole body trembled at her touch, as though contact with her was more than he had dared to hope for. Then, kiss me, husband. Thandric kissed her like a man who had been drowning and found air. Deep and desperate and reverent, his hands coming up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a tenderness that contradicted the urgency of his mouth. She tasted salt. His tears, or hers, she could not tell, and it did not matter. His arms wrapped around her, and she let herself be held, truly held, for the first time in months, and she felt something between them flare bright. Not a chain, not a bond forged by ceremony or law or tradition. A bridge, built from the wreckage of what they had been, spanning the distance between who they were now. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Elindra pressed her forehead against his. "Do not ever make me regret this. Never." The word was an oath, carved into the air between them with the weight and permanence of stone. "I swear on everything I am. Never again." From the nursery, a tiny cry broke the stillness. Then a second, joining in harmony, because Rowan and Lyraveth had inherited their mother's sense of timing and their father's talent for dramatic interruption. Elindra laughed, wiped her eyes. "Your heirs demand attention. Our heirs." Thandric took her hand, threaded their fingers together, held on like he would never let go, because he would not, because he had learned what letting go cost, and the lesson had nearly killed him. "Come on," he said. "Let us go be parents." They walked into the nursery together, and Elindra looked at the life she had built from the ashes of the one that burned. A mate who had learned, through pain and patience, and the slow, hard work of earning back what he had destroyed. 2 perfect children who would grow up knowing they were loved, fiercely and without condition, by a mother who had walked through fire for them and a father who had learned that fire was the only thing that could burn away pride and leave something worth keeping underneath. A kingdom that had welcomed her back, not as the disgraced Luna, not as the common girl from the border village, as the woman who had stood alone in a hall full of enemies and spoken the truth until it was the only sound left in the room. She had walked into that baby shower expecting celebration and received devastation instead. But devastation had not crushed her. It had compressed her, heated her, transformed her into something harder and brighter and more unbreakable than anything she had been before. The way pressure turns coal to diamond, the way fire turns clay to porcelain, the way the worst night of your life, if you survive it, if you refuse to let it define you, becomes the foundation of every good thing that follows. Elindra stood in the moonlight with her family around her, her daughter in her arms, her son in his father's arms, the mountain air cool against her skin, and the palace warm behind her, and the future stretching out ahead of them, imperfect and uncertain, and full of the kind of possibility that only exists on the other side of something you thought you would not survive. The darkest nights produce the brightest stars. She was proof. They all were.